How many times have we heard nonchalant remarks such as the Gospels or the Bible in more generic terms are too old to be trusted, and by consequence Jesus Christ is of too old that we can't even try to get to know Him. Do we take these remarks as nonchalant remarks, or do we take these things seriously? Hello and welcome. This is Arun Velusamy, and currently we're doing Operation Stevens live webinar series titled The Historical Jesus as God. This is a four-part series, and our current session is the first session. The title for today is Gospels as Historical Documents. Now, in the analysis of any historical person, of course, it is extremely important for us to establish reliable historical sources of information to examine the life of that specific person. And that is no different for the examination of the person called Jesus the Christ. What historical documents do we rely upon, especially as primary sources of information? And this is where Gospels come in. You may know about the Bible broadly, and in the Bible there are four specific books which are designated as the Gospels. They are the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These four are considered to be the primary sources of information on the historical Jesus. And of course, today what we are trying to do is we are trying to establish if these sources actually come from the first century. In other words, we are trying to establish if the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John could be considered as close enough to Jesus for us to use them to construct a picture of the person called Jesus the Christ. I'd like to also clarify a very important thing at this stage, which is, of course, this is a four-part live webinar series. In the first part, the topic today is actually just Gospels as historical documents, as opposed to Gospels being documents of history. What do I mean by that? Today, we are purely going to see if what we have as the Gospels in the Holy Bible actually come from the first century. The examination of whether the content of the Gospels are historical in nature, or in other words, Jesus himself is historical, would actually be followed up on sessions 2 and 3. Today, it's only Gospels as historical documents. Like I had introduced in the video that we had uploaded a week ago as an introduction for this series. This is going to be live webinar, and I'm hoping at least a few people would be joining with me today on this examination. Now, I do not expect anyone who joined today to have even a moderate knowledge about Jesus Christ. And therefore, we're going to do a detailed Q&A session, hopefully with some Q&As, questions from audience, that we would deal at the end of this session. Now, you would see on your screens right now details of how to ask your questions. You can type in to the live chat available in this YouTube channel. Alternatively, you can also text the number which is displayed on your screen right now. If you may please give me a few minutes time. Thank you. Ruby, can you please mute that? I do apologize, my friends. There seems to be a technical glitch. Someone is reporting that there is an echo on the audio. Please give me a few minutes for this to be sorted out. Thank you. Hello. I just heard from a friend who was logged in that there was an issue with the audio. So I'm afraid I'll have to start all over again. Many times we might have heard very nonchalant remarks like, can we depend on the gospel accounts? Or can we even take Jesus seriously as a historical person? And this is mainly because people, of course, rightly understand that Jesus and the Gospels are of about 20 centuries before our time. Do we take these remarks seriously, or do we consider these just as nonchalant remarks? Hello and welcome. This is Arul Velusamy, and I'd like to welcome you to this live webinar series as part of Operation Stephen. The current series is titled The Historical Jesus as God, and this is a 4-part webinar series. And today, the first session, we're going to talk about Gospels as historical documents. In the examination of any historical person or event, it is ultimately very crucial for us to establish reliable sources of information corresponding to the person or the object of study. And this is no different in regards to the life of Jesus Christ. What do we consider as the crucial sources of information about the life of Jesus the Christ? And that's where we have the 4 books called Gospels as available in the Holy Bible. These are the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are asserted to be primary sources of information about the life of Jesus Christ. But today our challenge is to establish if these are reliable 1st century documents. Just to clarify a very important thing at the start, today's topic is the Gospels as the historical documents, as opposed to Gospels being documents of history. What do we mean by that? Today we are purely going to talk about whether Gospels could be traced back all the way to the 1st century. In the following 2 sessions is when we would be dealing with the other topic of whether the content of the Gospels are actually historical in nature. In other words, as opposed to a fiction like the work of Harry Potter or a similar thing, we are going to establish that Jesus is in fact a person, a real person in human history. That's for sessions 2 and 3. Now let's gear up to continue with our topic of Gospels as historical documents. Like I had introduced in the introduction video, this is meant to be, the entire 4-session series is meant to be also intended mainly for people who may not even have a moderate knowledge about the life of Jesus the Christ. In other words, if you are listening to this webinar series today, please do not mind at the end when we do open up the floor for Q&A to ask any question that may be of concern in your mind in exploring about the life of Jesus Christ. Any question would be a valid question. Now in the screen, hopefully you should see details of how you could ask your questions. You should be able to text your questions to the live chat available on this channel. Alternatively, you can also text your questions to the mobile number shown in the screen right now. I'll give a few seconds for you to note the mobile number just in case that's your preferred mode of asking a question. Please do not hesitate to send in your question at any point during the conversation today. However, I'll address these questions at the end. Hopefully we'll have enough time to ask and answer those questions at the end, but with the technical glitch we had a bit earlier, time is going to be a bit short, so let's gear up for the next few stages. Now I'm going to structure my communication essentially in asking 2 specific questions. The first question I'm going to ask is whether we can trace all the available manuscripts for the Gospels all the way back to the 1st century. And the second question I would ask is if based on all the available copies of the manuscripts, we can actually be reasonably confident about the content of the original copy, the original, what we call the autograph, from where the other copies were made over a period of time. So those are the 2 questions. Now firstly, can we trace the Gospels all the way to the 1st century? If I give you an idea about how historical literary documents worked, now if you look at the screen right now, on your left you should see a material which is actually called papyrus based material, papyrus, whereas on the right you have what is called a parchment. The idea is at least beginning with the 1st century AD, the relevant technology available at that time where what you see on the left hand side, papyrus, this is plant based material, not very durable, very hard to write on, and the copies may not survive for long. Whereas on the right hand side, the parchment, what you see there is what is called the parchment. The technology to essentially write on a parchment began to be used from about the 3rd century AD, going up to the invention of a printing machine in the 15th century, printing machine of the movable type, which enabled mass printing possible. Parchments are made from animal skins, especially goats and sheep, animal skin, and they are highly durable, certainly much more durable than the parchment that you see, than the papyrus that you see on the left hand side. On your screen now, you should see two kinds of text. On the left hand side, both are of the Greek language. On the left hand side, you would see what would appear, if you compare that with our English alphabets, what would appear to be capital letters, and they are in fact capital Greek letters, what are called uncials. And on the right hand side, the title is similar to what is there on the left. The title is in uncial letters. However, the paragraph, the main text is actually in what we may call small letters or cursives, which is called minuscules. Now, during the time of usage of papyrus, mainly uncials were used. However, after parchments were used to record history beginning from the 3rd century, for the first 6 or 7 centuries, we mainly had uncial based text, whereas beginning from the 9th century AD and going up to the invention of the printing machines, minuscules or the cursives or small letters were used. Now, of course, the material used would depend on, similar to what we had earlier, which is the the papyrus and parchment. On the papyrus, it was mainly uncials which were used, because during that time no one thought about using cursives much, whereas during the time of usage of parchments, the earlier stage you had uncial recordings, whereas the later stage you had the cursives or minuscule recordings. One more finer detail also should be evident from what you are seeing in your screen right now. On the left hand side, you would see what we may call a scroll, whereas on the right hand side is something which we may call maybe a book. The scroll is technically also called a scroll by scholars, whereas what we call the book, which is on the right hand side, is technically actually called a codex, which actually means a book. Now, these are technical things that you would need to know when exploring the manuscripts of the Gospels. Now, just to get a gist of what we spoke about so far quickly, so at the bottom you should see a timeline: 1st century, 3rd century, 9th century and 15th centuries recorded there. Of course, the diagram is not drawn up to scale, and that's why the distance between the markings at the bottom would be almost equal, even though the time space is actually much different. But the point there is, during the first 3 centuries or so, it was mainly papyrus and mainly uncials. Papyrus and uncials were still used for a few more centuries, whereas beginning from the 3rd century we had parchments beginning to be used, and mainly uncial letters to begin with. And beginning somewhere from the 9th century, you had parchments with cursive letters, which are also called minuscules, beginning to be used. Now, that was an introduction to how historical documents work, the nature of historical documents, the finer detail that we care about when we try to explore historical documents, especially documents after the life of Jesus Christ, i.e. beginning from the 1st century. Now, of course, just to briefly throw in a point there, study of such literary documents is very dissimilar to study of some sort of historical artifacts like the pyramids or records on stones, or possibly even potteries and designs on potteries and stuff like that. Here we are talking about literary content, and even though we may have copies of copies coming over from all the way from the 1st century going forward, even reaching us in this 21st century, our main concern is trying to reach the original content, i.e. the content of what we call the autographs. Now, that's exactly what we are going to dwell into right now. Now, in specific, the Gospels. On the screen right now, you would see two of the earliest of Gospel manuscripts. You would see Codex Sinaiticus and I believe Codex Alexandrinus also there. Now, before I actually jump into this specific thing, let me briefly mention to you that actually manuscripts from between about the 9th century going up to the time of printing, we have about 3,000 manuscripts which are called minuscules, i.e. Small letter recordings on parchments, about 3,000 of them. Now, some of them were actually handed over through the tradition in the church. Some of them come from even outside of the church. But the fact of the matter is, to cover the period between the 9th century AD going up to the 15th century AD, we have about 3,000 minuscule manuscripts. Now, most of these have the Gospels. Some of these are entire New Testaments. And now, for people who may be slightly familiar with the Bible, you may appreciate that about the life of Jesus Christ and the church, the Gospels relate to Jesus Christ himself personally. Those are biographical works on the life of Jesus Christ, whereas the remaining portion of the New Testament actually deal with mainly the life of the early church. There's also a book on prophecies about the future. Now, like I said earlier, just to reiterate, the 3,000 minuscule manuscripts, most of them have all the Gospels. Some of them have the entire New Testament. In other words, for the Bible, we can certainly, using the minuscules, trace all the way back up to the 9th century AD. Now, what we are looking at here are majuscules or uncials, which are capital letter recordings, like what we saw earlier in the introduction about literary documents. Before the 9th century, we really need to depend on uncial manuscripts for us to trace the origin of certain documents back all the way to the time of when it was written, and that's where uncials come in. Now, Codex Sinaiticus is what you see on the left, I believe, is a document from the 4th century. Codex Sinaiticus has almost the entire New Testament. As a matter of fact, it has almost the entire Bible. Now, the manuscript you see in the middle, I believe, is Codex Alexandrinus, which actually comes from the 5th century. Now, even Codex Alexandrinus has almost, it certainly has 3 Gospels, and for Matthew, it doesn't have much portion, but it does have some fragmentary evidence for the existence of the Gospel of Matthew with some content which resembles what we see today. Now, in other words, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Alexandrinus would take us back all the way to the 4th century AD, from where the minuscule manuscripts left us. But if you are very concerned about 5th century going up to 9th century, may I please comment before you that we actually have about just less than 300 uncial manuscripts, which give us detail, which give us the Gospels from the time of about 3rd century, 4th century, going up to the 9th century. In other words, we do not lose any continuity when we look at uncials and the minuscules. If I may mention a few other uncials just for your perusal: Codex Ephrani, Codex Bezae, Codex Borgianus, Codex Washingtonensis, Codex Dublinensis, and uncial manuscript 0171 are some of the prominent manuscripts from the first 5 centuries which have content from the Gospels that we have today. Now, looking at the 4 Gospels one at a time, just to get some understanding about the first 3 or 4 centuries, because with the uncial manuscripts we have come all the way to the 4th century AD. Now, where papyrus manuscripts come in are in fact in really taking us from where the uncials leave us all the way back close to the 1st century. For example, on the screen right now, on the left hand side, you should see a picture of a fragment of the Gospel of Matthew. Now, this fragment is called Papyrus 104, and this fragment dates from mid-2nd century. As a matter of fact, this fragment is available in Oxford, UK. So if you're interested, this may be something that you could easily access if you're based in the UK. This is a parchment fragment of the Gospel of Matthew. On the right hand side, you should see a table with more information on more similar parchment manuscripts. For example, P64, which is also called P67. P there stands for papyrus. The P which is actually used by scholars isn't the English P, but rather a bit different. But for ease of communication, I've just mentioned our regular English P there. And that dates from the 3rd century or end of 2nd century. And then you see P77 and then P103, P1, P45, and so on. Now, if you may see, look at the names in the 2nd column in the table from the left, you would see P Oxy 4404 and similarly P Oxy 2683. Now, those are specific descriptive names given to these manuscripts as opposed to pure numeral based identifiers. And the P Oxy actually refers to one of 3 very prominent families of parchment manuscripts. If we consider the book of Mark, on the left hand side you would see what is called Papyrus 45, and this specific manuscript dates to the mid-3rd century, and this is again a fragmentary manuscript, and this has chapters 4 to 9 and 11 to 12 in it. Now, this is for the book of Mark. This is the only manuscript which is so far available and catalogued from the first 3 centuries. Even though it's only one, of course, as we saw earlier, the uncials take us all the way back up to the 4th century, and this manuscript would give us the link jumping into mid-3rd century. Looking at the book of Luke, on the left hand side you would see what is called Papyrus 75, which is the oldest available manuscript for the book of Luke. This specific manuscript dates to late 2nd century to early 3rd century. This is called Papyrus Bodmer, which is one of the 3 main families of papyrus manuscripts that we have available today. One, of course, we saw earlier, P. Oxy, now we see P. Bodmer, and then we'd also see Chester Beatty, which is the 3rd in the list provided there, which is P45. But again, you see a few other papyrus manuscripts which enable us trace the content of the book of Luke all the way back to late 2nd century. Now on the screen you see a specific manuscript, 2 sides of a fragment available for the earliest available manuscript for the book of John, which is P52, Papyrus 52. This is also called John Ryland's papyrus. Now this specific manuscript is available in Manchester in John Ryland's library for us to access. This is not alone the earliest of available manuscripts for the book of John, but also the earliest of available manuscripts for all of the New Testament. This specific manuscript dates to early 2nd century. There is an argument from some areas of academia that this should even be dated to late 1st century, but the most scholars estimate this to be from early 2nd century. Again, a fragmentary manuscript at our disposal. Now, what we have seen in the last 4 screens are specific details about papyrus manuscripts from the first 3 centuries for the books Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Now, we initially saw information about minuscules taking us all the way back to the 9th century, and then we saw information about uncials which take us from the 9th century all the way back to early 4th century, and then now we are seeing, now we just saw in the last 4 slides papyrus fragments which would allow us to go all the way back to early 2nd century to mid 2nd century to late 2nd century in some cases. Now the challenge of course is the uncials, at least Codex Sinaiticus was complete New Testament with almost complete Gospels, but what we are seeing in the papyrus manuscripts are that all of these are fragments. So of course the question in our minds would be, well, how trustworthy are fragments? Now it is in this context it is extremely important for us to understand that historical documents are not this easy to have access to, as we may see after a brief period of time where I compare the availability of manuscripts that we have for the Gospels as compared to some of the other historical works right through human history. And when doing that, we would figure out what we do have for the Gospels is as best as we could have in the entire human history. Now, scholars are reasonably convinced that the fragmentary evidence, even though does not give us the entire content of the Gospels in the first 3 centuries, because their content matches with some of the content that we get from the uncials, these give us a reasonable level of confidence about the content of the Gospels going back up to the 2nd century. Now, so far we only saw manuscripts which are mainly in Greek. Now, what I like to do is also look at manuscripts that are available from or in other languages. This is extremely crucial, especially because of the point I made a bit earlier, where from the 2nd century and 3rd century we only have fragmentary evidence. The availability of manuscripts, of translations of the Gospels from about early 2nd century in various other languages as opposed to the original Greek we saw far would give us a great leap in our confidence about the content of the Greek manuscripts themselves. If you look at the map that is showing up in front of you right now, you may be able to spot where Israel is. If you look at the map, between the lines which actually say Syriac and Ethiopic, that's rough. I mean, midway between there to the west is where Israel is, and that is where Jesus was believed to have walked around and ministered and so on. Now that's where the original manuscripts were written, and copies from those originals began to be circulated to all sorts of other places. Now what you see in the map is a rough idea of the coverage of translations of these Greek manuscripts into various other languages across the world in the 2nd century going up to even the 10th century and so on. So on the screen you would see very close to the land of Israel, in Syria of those times, the language of the land, Syriac, you have translations in that language, and we do have access to texts which scholars estimate to be actually from the 2nd century. In other words, this Syriac, the Syriac text that we have, which are 2 manuscripts of the Gospels with some gaps, Syriac C and Syriac S, are actually estimated to be from the 5th and 4th century respectively, but they do show text form which actually come from the 2nd century. In other words, it's pretty much like if you hear English which has thee, thou and so on, you may be able to reasonably predict that text might have come from somewhere around the 16th century or so, because these words are no longer in common use. Similar to that, we see texts from the 2nd century available in these manuscripts of the 4th and 5th centuries. Apart from this, we have entire Bibles, about 350 manuscripts available in what is called Syrian Vulgate language. Now if I may move on, of course in the map you would see Ethiopic and Coptic, which are again close enough to the land of Israel, and Ethiopia had a close relationship with Israel throughout most of human history, and similarly even Egypt had a relationship. Of course there you would see how we have manuscripts from very early in history from Egypt in the Coptic language, a few different manuscripts, and similarly Ethiopic. Now if we look at Europe, you should also see manuscripts which are available in Latin, manuscripts which are available in Gothic, in Anglo-Saxon, in Old Slavonic, and if you look at sort of former USSR kind of area, you would see manuscripts which are available from Georgian, Armenian languages also. And then further east you should also see Persian and Sogdian languages mentioned. The point is, in the 2nd century you had, or beginning from the 2nd century going forward, you had a proliferation of the translations of the Gospels into other languages also. Now what do we deal with, what do we do with what we have found so far? Now what we have found so far is that the Greek Gospel manuscripts take us all the way, certainly back to the 4th century, but with the papyrus fragmentary evidence, with reasonable level of confidence, knowing how history works, we could go to even early 2nd century, to mid to late 2nd century in some cases of the Gospels. But what we also saw are manuscripts of the translation of Gospels in various other languages, far and wide from where Gospels are believed to be originally written. In other words, the point is, the content of the Gospels was fairly spread in a short period of time from the 1st century, and that gives us a very high level of confidence about the fact that we could trace the Gospel all the way up to the 1st century. Now, I'd like to compare this against some of the other historical works quickly, just to get an idea of how other historical works fare up in relation to Gospel accounts. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to pinpoint only a couple of sources here. For example, if you look at Suetonius, who is a historian who lived in the 1st century to 2nd century, he was writing between AD 70. He lived between AD 75 and 160, and during that period, of course, he wrote a few things, including the book called the 12 Caesars and so on. The earliest of the copies of the works of Suetonius that we have access to is actually from the 10th century AD, and so the gap between when he wrote and the time from which we have the earliest manuscript of his work is about 800 years, and we have only 8 copies of the work of Suetonius. Now that's a comparison between a work in the 1st century, again the Gospels. Now, the only thing which even comes any close to the Gospels is a very popular work called Iliad from Homer. You might have seen the movie called the Troy, which was loosely based on the Iliad of Homer. Now, this was actually written, believed to be written about the 10th century BC, but the earliest of manuscripts that we have access to are fragments from the 5th century BC or 4th century BC, but to get any reasonable content, we need to move to the AD section of history. Now, we have about 600 odd manuscripts, including fragments, and this is how this is the closest competitor to the Gospels in terms of historical documents or historical literature, manuscripts. The fact of the matter is, Homer Iliad is believed to be extremely popular in the ancient world in terms of fictional literature, partly historical, partly fictional. There's still some argument about which portions are fictional and which portions are historical. But that's where the Gospels stand. Gospels are arguably the best historical literature available from antiquity. Now, what we have seen so far is the fact that we can trace the Gospels all the way to the 2nd century, and we have reasonable confidence about the content of the Gospels to have actually even come from the 1st century if we evaluate it in proper historical context of how other documents fare up. So far we have plenty of manuscripts that we can have access to explore what we are doing in this webinar series, which is examining the life of Jesus Christ. But like I said earlier, the second part of today's topic is in exploring this crucial point, which is, well, we have plenty of manuscripts. Can we understand the content of the original content of the autographs of these manuscripts? Of course, you might be familiar with the various versions of the Bible. Now, I'd like to make a brief note here, which is most of the differences in the different versions in the English Gospels that you find not because the manuscripts themselves are so deviant from each other, but because the principles used in translation are quite different. On the one hand side, you have what is called literary translation, i.e. literal translation, i.e. word for word translation, which is a technique used by the translators of King James Bible or New King James Bible. So their attempt is mainly to translate each word at a time and then to form sensible English statements based on that. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you have even translations like what we call the Message version today, which are complete paraphrases, at best limited by the knowledge of the translator of these versions. Now, I'd like you with that. I'd like to talk to you about the different classes of manuscripts that we have. Having spoken about the fact that the versions are mainly different from each other because of the translation principles and not necessarily because of the content of the manuscripts. Having said that, there is plenty of analysis which has been done on the manuscripts themselves. There are differences which are noticed. For example, if you look at the bottom half of the screen, you would see Textus Receptus, you would see majority text, you would see Nestle-Aland or UBS text. These are broadly the more prominent text types which are in use today. These are compiled Greek New Testaments from about the time of 16th century. The Textus Receptus is actually from the 16th century, whereas majority text is essentially a compilation or a critical text from mainly using minuscules which date from the 10th century going up to the 15th century or 16th century, leading up to the invention of printing press, and then the Nestle-Aland text and UBS text actually being a critical text from using all available manuscripts, but mainly having more weight for the earliest of the manuscripts, earliest of uncials available at our disposal. When I use the term critical text, what I do really mean is having all manuscripts side by side and essentially synthesizing verses from there, and also noting the specific differences which are there in the different manuscripts. Now, broadly speaking, manuscripts are categorized into what you see at the top, Alexandrian text, majority text, and there are a couple of other less prominent texts like Caesarean text, Western text, so on. Now, there is also a special category which is a few minuscule manuscripts which the church knows to be handed over throughout generations from the 4th century going up to the 16th century, when Erasmus had access to that and compiled his Greek New Testament, namely Textus Receptus. Point is, there are variations, but the variations are not serious. The variations are less, but we still take these variations seriously for us to study these variations in detail. If I may now show you some examples of variations. I'm aware of the fact that we are running out of time a bit there, and therefore I'd like to just jump on to showing you a list of some example variations that we have just to understand how these things work. For example, at the top you should see Matthew chapter 8 verse 28, and then the first line you should see majority text or Textus Receptus, the content of that, and then below that you should see what is called the critical text. Majority text is a synthesis from most available manuscripts which agree almost with each other. Now, if you look at the statements themselves, the fact of the matter is the first example shows you differences in the spelling or in the name gatherings. Now in one group of manuscripts you have Gergesenes, whereas in the other critical text, because a different name is used in some earlier manuscripts, that is adopted in the critical text, and that is gatherings. Now similarly we see differences in spellings of different names. We see different orderings of Greek words which actually do not have any specific implication in English translations. They do not have implications also in the Greek language in terms of understanding the statement. They have implication only in terms of seeing that there are differences between manuscripts, but in terms of meaning they are quite the same. Second example, you should see Mark chapter 2 verse 16, and then so the second example you would see in the critical text, you see a shorter verse as compared to a longer verse in the majority text or Textus Receptus. In the book of Luke, you should see the example shows the fact that there is an omission of a specific verse in the critical text, i.e. the earliest available uncials, and in the book of John you should see again the group of words, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," is recorded as "You are the Holy One of God" in a shorter form in the critical text. Now point is, if you look at these things and if you follow with me on sessions 2 and 3, what you would find is that even though these are technically differences, these do not have any material impact in the core life of the person of Jesus the Christ. Having said that, I should mention that there are the most major two differences that we see in these manuscripts actually correspond to the ending of the book of Mark, where the majority text has a longer ending, what is called a longer ending. Mark chapter 16 verses 9 forward until the end of the chapter is available in most of the manuscripts, and that's why it's part of what is called the majority text. Whereas in some of the oldest of the ancient manuscripts, you don't see this specific part. The longer ending is absent. But the fact of the matter is, even ignoring the longer ending, you would actually see the fact that a witness saw that a tomb where Jesus was placed in was empty, and the witness received information that Jesus had risen from a person the witness had met in the tomb. In other words, crucial elements are still retained, so that specific detail we may touch upon in one of our next two sessions. The other major difference is the fact that you might know about the fact that an adulteress came to meet Jesus, an adulteress was taken before Jesus by some people who wanted to stone her to death because she was caught during the act of adultery. That specific portion is not available in some of the oldest of uncial manuscripts available to us, even though most of the remaining manuscripts do have that portion. Those two are the most major differences between the manuscripts that are available at our disposal. Now, sorry, if you may please go back. So the point now is, earlier we saw the fact that we could trace back Gospels all the way back to the 1st century. Now we have seen that the thousands of manuscripts which are available at our disposal, even though they show some differences, the differences are not material, as you might have seen from the examples. Now, if you're still a bit skeptical about this, in the next two sessions, when we actually get a crux of the life of Jesus, the important parts of the life of Jesus, which would lead us to trust in Jesus as supernatural at all, you would see that crux does not include any of the things that we have so far mentioned. Now, that's where we have got to so far. I assume that you were with me so far, and I hope our understanding right now with the analysis that we have done so far is that the Gospels are in fact historical documents, and that we could certainly go back to early 2nd century, and then based on some of the analysis that we did about some other historical documents, we could have high level of confidence that the Gospels could be traced back even to the 1st century. Now I'd like to open up the floor for questions. I do know we are running a bit short on time. I don't know how many questions we have online on the live channel on YouTube. I did see a question which came in via a text message. Let me please see what that's about. Okay, question. How do you account for slightly different accounts of the Gospels within the Bible, particularly with the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ? That's a very good question. How do we account for slightly different accounts of the Gospels within the Bible, particularly with the crucifixion and resurrection? Now, this thing, of course, we didn't touch upon in our discussion so far, but let me briefly mention a few things there to us. Based on a careful, detailed analysis, I believe that even though the 4 different Gospels have what may appear to be different accounts, which they are, and that's why there are 4 different Gospels, but they are complementary in nature and not contradictory at all. I'm not sure during which specific session we'd be touching upon that, if at all we would, but perhaps during one of our next 3 sessions we would take that up, at least in the Q&A session, if I don't take that up during my communication to you. But to answer it in short right now, I believe the 4 different Gospels and the accounts of the 4 different Gospels, especially the accounts of the crucifixion and resurrection, are very, very complementary in nature and not contradictory at all. You would see, for example, a woman being a witness for the resurrected Jesus in one account, whereas you would see a group of women being witnesses for the resurrection of Jesus in another account. So the question would be, was it one woman? Was it a group of women? The answer simply is the fact that when there are a group of women witnessing resurrected Jesus or an empty tomb followed by a resurrected Jesus, one writer could legitimately record the fact that as a group they saw an empty tomb, whereas as they were walking back, as a single lady, she saw resurrected, one of the ladies saw resurrected Jesus alone. That's a legitimate explanation for that specific apparent contradiction, and that those things are complementary in nature and not contradictory. The answer is, if we look at every single difference with that level of detail, what we would see is that they are all complementary, not contradictory. Ruby, is there any other question there at all on the live channel? No? Okay. I'm not sure if anyone else has a question at all in what we have discussed so far. I'm aware of the fact that we have come to almost the end of our session. If you do have any question, please do text it in the next few seconds or so. Otherwise, we'd call it an evening, not call it a day, but call it an evening perhaps, and close the session. I hope this session was useful for you in understanding that the Gospels are in fact historical documents coming from the 1st century. I believe there is no other question for us on YouTube. Yeah, there's none else. Thank you very much for tuning in, and thank you for patiently listening to what we have been discussing so far. And I do apologize for the late start and the technical glitch at the start. and I do thank Ravi for pointing out the fact that we had an issue there. Thank you, and may God bless you. In the slide which is coming up right now, you should see the details of the upcoming sessions. Please do join me in the next 3 sessions also. Thank you, and God bless you.